Welcome to JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the co-host of JAT Chat. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Brett Pexa, who is an assistant professor of athletic training at High Point University. He is author of Throwing Loads Does Not Affect Musculoskeletal Measures Around Competitive Pitching in Adolescent Baseball Pitchers, published in the Journal of Athletic Training. Brett, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
So starting with a very broad question for our listeners, what's the landscape of evidence regarding baseball pitchers and upper extremity injury risk factors? What types of injuries are we seeing and what's causing them?
Yeah, I think we first look at baseball players in general. If you take a look at the epidemiology, the first thing you'll notice is that actually the most common injury is a hamstring strain, right? Our fielding counterparts have a lot of running to do. So there's a lot of kind of muscular strains, still lateral ankle sprains in there. But the highest burden of injury that we get is actually within our baseball pitchers. Our baseball pitchers, especially at the adolescent level, get these injuries that remove them from sport for an extended period of time, right? So it's not just the fact that they are happening frequently, but it is the fact that when we get one, these pitchers have to work through quite a bit, right? And we think of the things that are always out there in the media, like a Tommy John injury, the ulnar collateral ligament tear. But there's a lot of other things that can happen too, right? We've seen things like as severe as thoracic outlet syndrome, right, affecting some of the shoulders of our professional baseball players. We see things like labral tears pretty consistently, some rotator cuff irritation. I mean, there's a lot of overuse injuries that can occur about the shoulder, even kind of acute and chronic injuries happening about the elbow. We can have acute tears of the UCL, chronic tears of the UCL. We can even have some bone spurs around that place as well. So when we take a look at the landscape in general, we first see, okay, these are the injuries that we're seeing. And because the baseball pitchers have such a high burden of injury, we need to understand maybe how those individuals get hurt. So the first thing that we've looked at, or the first thing that we see in the literature, is we break these down into kind of those intrinsic factors and those extrinsic factors. The intrinsic factors are what's happening to us. If baseball pitchers start to lose strength, and especially if we start to lose a lot of range of motion, well, the baseball pitching motion is pretty unforgiving in those realms. We need a lot of motion to move through that overall. We need a lot of strength to stabilize the humeral head, stabilize the medial elbow joint. I tell my students all the time, the UCL, right, in cadaver studies fails at 36 Newton meters, but when we throw, we can put upwards of 70, 80, or 90 Newton meters on it, right? So the strength that has to come from the medial forearm flexor group is important, and it's protective of that medial elbow joint area. So those intrinsic risk factors like range of motion and strength are obviously pretty important, but then the extrinsic factors as well, right? There's evidence that says throwing a lot leads to more injuries, right? Throwing hard leads to more injuries. One of the best pieces of evidence is that if we are actually playing pitcher and catcher, if we play both those positions, we're at a higher risk of injury as well. So there's a lot of different factors that come together, and the extrinsic pieces of, how much are we playing, how much are we throwing, and the intrinsic factors of what are the musculoskeletal changes around this are kind of tied together too, right? If we play more, maybe we see more negative changes in those intrinsic factors. And then, right, if we maybe play a little bit less, maybe we'll see them recover. So we're trying to balance those two things out and understand how they play together.
So along the lines of the extrinsic factors, I know there's some pitch count guidelines. Can you talk a little bit about what those current guidelines are to manage these upper extremity load in baseball pitchers?
Yeah, a lot of our early research in the 2000s helped set up and indicate that these extrinsic factors are leading to more injuries, right? The more throwing and throwing more, especially at younger ages. So USA Baseball came out with their Pitch Smart guidelines, which are age-adjusted pitch count guidelines and rest and recovery guidelines to ensure that baseball players are not overexerting themselves, right? That we're developing pitchers through a longer period of time. They start, I think, as low as 12 or 13 years old, and they'll go up even to 18 and 20-year-olds as well. So, and when we get to those 18-year-olds too, right, there's more leniency with them, right? There's 100 pitch count in there. We're still expecting them to take larger rest and recovery pieces with it as well. But there are still some limitations within those pitch counts, I think, that we've learned. We don't have any communication from team to team. So if somebody's playing with a one competitive travel team and maybe more of a local high school team, then they don't communicate one to another. So maybe I pitch midweek and then pitch on the weekends, and I'm still technically following the guidelines, but not really following them when I have both teams. The other thing that it's not taking into account is kind of the exertional pieces of it, right? We don't pitch counts are pitch counts, right? Everybody could pick up and throw 60 pitches. Now, sometimes that ball feels like a feather, right? You pick it up and you're throwing it, and it's easy to throw, and it's easy to get it to the plate. And other times, it feels like a shot put. So the exertional piece on top of it is important for us to think about. In other sports, we do this really well. We take heart rate monitors and put them on people for wearables. We can take an RPE and create a session rating of perceived exertion as well. So because we have some limitations in the intrinsic pieces, we want to see maybe how this all ties together a little bit more complete.
With knowing some of these limitations, it sounds like your study was trying to address some of them. So could you tell us a little bit about the purpose of your study to try to address some of this limitation?
Yeah, we know that we see physical changes after pitching, right? We know that we lose some strength, we lose some range of motion, but we didn't necessarily know if that's kind of in like a dose response relationship. If we throw 50 pitches, is that half as taxing as maybe 100 pitches? And on top of that, we also wanted to take in that internal account, right? Hey, if this person is throwing 50 pitches at a 3 RPE, is it the same as throwing 50 pitches at a 10 RPE? So by adding in the internal load piece and capturing that external load, the pitch count itself, combining those together and then understanding what are the time course changes over it all and how did that load actually create the response in those musculoskeletal factors. It was really understanding, is there a dose response relationship between these two, right? Do the extrinsic factors really start to lead to the changes in those intrinsic factors of range of motion and strength?
One of the variables I found very fascinating when reading your article was this ARM PE, which
Yeah.
I love the acronym there. Can you just tell us a little bit more explicitly what that variable is?
Yeah, so when we think of the extrinsic load variables, right, we're thinking pitch count, right? Training load itself is, from a global perspective, is often brought into as an external load or an internal load. External loads are what we do: steps, distance, throws. In this case, how many throws did the pitcher themselves make? Internal loads are the perceptual or physiological response. So oftentimes taken with a heart rate monitor if you have a wearable and the opportunity. But this was in an adolescent athlete group. We wanted to keep this applicable for our adolescent athlete clinicians, coaches, strength coaches, parents even, who have access to an RPE. So the arm PE, as we like to call it, right, to keep it shoulder and elbow specific for baseball players, was we simply did a session rating of perceived exertion, if people are familiar with that. We took the total external load, we took the total internal load, and we multiplied those together. In other sports, the session rating perceived exertion is actually a very valid way to measure how difficult or how taxing a particular activity was. So we want to do the same thing here. We used it in the past in a longitudinal setting with some success. So we wanted to see then on an individual basis, how did those two come together, right? And if the dose response relationship, was it dependent on the external load, the throw count? Was it dependent on the internal load, the RPE? Or was it dependent on that total arm PE kind of together? It just kind of helps parse out like which of these things are driving the changes behind it all.
Yeah, that was very fascinating when reading the article. And you also had several different types of variables to measure this recovery time course for musculoskeletal recovery. Can you talk a little bit about those variables that you included in the study?
Yeah, so we wanted to get something a little bit more nitty gritty down into the muscle belly itself. So we had an ultrasound machine, and the ultrasound images that we took were of the infraspinatus, rotator cuff muscle in the back of the shoulder. Think of it almost as like the brakes of the shoulder, right? As soon as we release that ball, that infraspinatus has to slam on the brakes, kind of centralize that humeral head into the glenoid cavity. By centralizing it and doing that eccentric motion, it really has some muscle disrupting forces to it. So in previous research, we've seen that muscle actually does swell up a little bit after eccentric exercise and in college baseball players. So we wanted to use that as well. So we looked at the muscle size of the infraspinatus, the echo intensity, which is basically like kind of what's inside that muscle and telling us like, hey, do we see more water infiltration? Do we see more like glycogen is kind of the theory behind it. Is it depleted? Is it getting inflammatory pieces in there? things like that. And we also took some of our more standard clinical measures. In any baseball athletic trainer listening to this knows, right? Internal and external rotation at the shoulder were definitely going to be important for long-term shoulder health. So we took internal and external rotation ranges of motion, but we also took internal and external rotation peak forces. I mean, we wanted to take that because the peak force piece really gets at to those kind of the muscle firing capabilities. We wanted to understand, hey, how strong were these muscles? In classic laboratory fatigue studies, strength is really the thing that's telling us, hey, there's muscle damage or there's something changing here. So we wanted to take the strength measures of this as well. So, right, the underlying constructs of really shoulder strength, shoulder range of motion, and then more of like a kind of nitty gritty inside musculoskeletal swelling or soreness piece with that cross sectional area and the ultrasound pieces.
Well, thank you for explaining that. And just listening to you makes me want to take a class with Dr. Pexa to learn more about the things. But let's get to the good stuff. What did you find? What was the most important finding of the study?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we want to do is just understand is there are a lot of big changes in the time course recovery of pitching. Um, from the ultrasound perspective, we didn't see a ton of it, right? In our college players, we do see some musculoskeletal swelling of the infraspinatus. We actually didn't see that here in our baseball pitchers, and we have some theories as to why that might be. But we did see some changes in internal rotation peak force and external rotation peak force that look like more traditional kind of recovery curves, right? Significant decreases in external rotation peak force after pitching, recovery in subsequent days. Internal rotation had differences between immediately post pitching and day 5 post pitching. So we did see kind of more of a traditional recovery curve there. I think the most important findings of this study, or if you read the title, you know what it is. None of those loading characteristics, the external load, the internal load, or that total arm PE, correlated with the changes that we saw between pre-pitching and post-pitching, or pre-pitching in day 1 or day 3 or day 5. So the changes weren't kind of a one-to-one correlation of the load that's experienced, right? So the strength didn't change according to the load, the range of motion didn't change according to the load. It was very different across all of our participants. You know, this was kind of completely counterintuitive to our hypothesis. We thought, hey, as we reach higher and higher pitch counts, well, all of a sudden, maybe we're going to start to see that we're going to see larger changes, right? We're going to see larger decreases. And maybe at lower pitch counts, we don't see any change. We see a slight increase because these pitchers are prepared for it. So I think that was, I think, one of the most interesting pieces of it all, because it just was so counterintuitive to how we think as clinicians. We think more load, more negative change. But here, more load didn't necessarily mean that.
So how do we make sense of these null findings then?
I think one of the big things that, when we started the study, we wanted to use pitch counts because that's kind of our hallmark load variable. Well, in the years since, we've gotten more and more evidence coming out that says pitch counts might not be the most reflective measure of total arm load. Right, pitch counts are great, but if I pitch 6 innings and throw 75, 80, 100 pitches, well, each time I go out there, I throw 5 or 10 warm-up pitches. I have 50 pitches in the bullpen before I get out there. If I'm and this was all in adolescent athletes, right? This was actually in travel baseball players over their summer and high school teams. There's a lot of them who are two-way players, right? There's a lot of arm actions in the game and in the sport that we don't often think of, right? So if we're a right-handed pitcher and a right-handed batter, as soon as we make contact with a bat, there's even deceleration pieces at the shoulder and the back of the shoulder in our dominant limb that we have to take a part of too. So I think there's a lot of shoulder actions that we just left on the table. Jason Zaremski has some great research out on that exact thing. We only capture about 60%, or pitch counts only capture about 60% of the external load total. So I think what we have to do moving forward are make sure that we get a better understanding of what is the shoulder going through in these games, and specifically in the adolescent population, right? Two-way players are extremely unique. Unless you're Shohei Ohtani, in Major League Baseball, you're not playing two ways. So this two-way piece in our adolescent population might actually be a huge player. And we have to find and capture all the shoulder actions, total shoulder actions that are happening to really get an understanding of the external load. I still think the internal load pieces are something we should consider. As we look at a lot of our other data that we've captured here at High Point, we're leaning more and more into the internal load area, understanding, heart rate zones and the amount of exertion. As we work at higher heart rate zones, how is that physiological system taxed? How's the local system taxed? And how does that create changes within the musculoskeletal system? So moving forward, right, we just have to kind of understand, hey, like we need to make sure we capture all the total shoulder actions. We want to still make sure that we are maybe measuring RPE, and also then understanding that it's not a one-to-one correlation, right? We're not, if we throw twice as much, we don't necessarily have twice as much of the change. And using those responses, using those musculoskeletal variables with consistent testing can be super beneficial.
So it sounds like you have a lot more work to do, Dr. Pexa.
Yeah, I know, plenty, as do all of us.
So wrapping up, can you provide a take-home point about your paper for our listeners?
Yeah, I think the take home point that I would say is despite that, pitch counts and RPEs don't correlate to those musculoskeletal changes, right? We should first try and understand what are the total shoulder actions that we're experiencing, right? By trying a parent out there listening for their, a son or daughter or an athletic trainer who's working with some of these high school athletes, try to quantify some of those total shoulder actions. If someone's playing both positions, playing a pitcher and then going to a high volume position like shortstop afterwards too, there's more throws, there's more shoulder actions in there. The other big thing I think that everybody can take away is to understand this kind of dose response relationship, because I think we're learning more and more that that kind of spreads across sport. The things that we do should drive the musculoskeletal changes. And by understanding that relationship, hopefully we can impact it. So, right, understand what are we doing on the field? How is that changing afterwards? So, within the context of this study, measure some of the outcomes, measure the range of motions, measure the strength pieces, because hopefully that tells you where a particular individual is at from a musculoskeletal perspective. And then by intervening, hopefully you'll make positive changes and keep your athletes healthy for a long, long time.
Well, I know I've learned a ton during this conversation. And Brett, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby. Appreciate having me.
And as a reminder to our listener, this article is available free of charge through the Journal of Athletic Training, and I highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript. Again, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.